The galaxy never remembered the battles that almost happened. It only remembered the single act of kindness that made them unnecessary. The warning sirens echoed through Kestrel Station before dawn, their low metallic wail rolling across the aging corridors like distant thunder. Red emergency lights pulsed against weathered steel walls, washing every dent and scratch in restless color. Dockworkers abandoned half-loaded cargo crates. Maintenance drones froze in place as automated safety protocols locked down every exterior airlock. Outside the reinforced observation windows, the endless darkness of space slowly disappeared beneath countless points of blue-white light. At first, everyone assumed they were stars. Then the tactical displays corrected themselves. They were ships, hundreds of them, then hundreds more. Within 90 seconds, the station's long-range sensors stopped assigning individual identification markers and switched to mass formation analysis. 912 confirmed vessels. Additional signatures still emerging from hyperspace. Silence spread through the command center more quickly than panic ever could. Captain Nora Hayes stared at the tactical projection hovering above the operations table, her fingers tightening around the edge until her knuckles turned pale. Every icon represented a warship. Carriers, destroyers, escort frigates, heavy cruisers, the kind of fleet powerful governments spent generations building. Yet none of the ships raised weapons. None altered attack formations. None transmitted threats. They simply waited, perfectly still, as though the entire armada had reached its destination and was waiting for someone to answer the door. Any identification? Nora asked without taking her eyes off the display. Lieutenant Marcus Bell swallowed before speaking. Confirmed visual markings. Asterian Fleet Command. The room became even quieter. Everyone had heard the stories. The Asterian fleet rarely crossed civilized space, and when it did, history usually changed afterward. Entire trade routes shifted. Governments negotiated new treaties overnight. Even pirates vanished from nearby sectors. Nobody invited the Asterian fleet anywhere. It simply arrived when it had already made a decision. A soft electronic chime interrupted the silence. An incoming transmission. Encrypted. Priority Alpha. Marcus glanced toward the captain. She nodded once. Put it through. The enormous central display flickered. Static rippled across the screen before resolving into a single silver emblem unlike any language spoken on Earth. Beneath it appeared only one line of standard galactic text. No greeting. No explanation. No demand for surrender. Just one sentence. Bring us Ethan Brooks. Nobody spoke. Marcus blinked twice, convinced he had misread it. Run that again, Nora ordered. The computer replayed the message word for word. Bring us Ethan Brooks. She frowned. Search station personnel. Marcus's fingers raced across the console. No senior officers. Another search. No registered diplomats. Another search. No government representatives. He hesitated before looking up. There is one Ethan Brooks. Nora turned. Who is he? Marcus looked almost embarrassed by the answer. Maintenance Division C, Senior Structural Engineer. 38 years of service. Currently assigned to Dock 7 Environmental Systems. Around the room, confused glances passed between officers. An engineer. Not an admiral. Not a politician. Not a scientist whose discoveries could reshape civilizations. Just a man who spent his days repairing aging life support conduits and replacing worn magnetic seals. Outside the observation windows, the immense fleet remained motionless, its formation stretching farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Thousands of navigation lights glowed like a second constellation suspended above the station. Not a single weapon powered up. Not a single fighter launched. They were waiting with impossible patience. Deep inside Dock 7, Ethan Brooks never heard the sirens. The maintenance tunnel around him hummed with the steady vibration of recycled air moving through decades-old ventilation pipes. His work light illuminated a narrow section of exposed conduit, while tiny particles of frost drifted from a cooling valve that had finally decided to fail after nearly 20 years of loyal service. He wiped a grease-stained hand across his forehead and tightened one last connector with a practiced twist. The vibration disappeared. Airflow stabilized. Somewhere overhead, people were staring at the largest fleet most of them would ever see. Ethan simply packed away his tools, unaware that nearly 1,000 warships had crossed the galaxy for a reason that began with a forgotten promise made many years earlier. Ethan Brooks climbed down the maintenance ladder with the slow confidence of someone who had spent most of his life inside machines that were older than some planet's governments. The steel rungs creaked beneath his boots while warm air carrying the familiar scent of recycled oxygen and machine oil drifted through the narrow shaft. His toolbox felt heavier than usual, although he suspected that had more to do with age than weight. 40 years of repairing failing systems had taught him one simple truth. Everything eventually broke. The important part was deciding what deserved to be repaired. His wrist communicator suddenly vibrated against his sleeve. Not the casual tone reserved for routine maintenance requests. This was the station-wide emergency frequency. Ethan frowned and pressed the receiver. Maintenance Division C. Brooks speaking. Static crackled for a brief second before an anxious voice answered. Mr. Brooks, stop what you are doing immediately. Security is on the way to escort you. Ethan looked around the empty service corridor. Frost still clung to the coolant pipes above his head, sparkling beneath the pale maintenance lights. Escort me where? Command center. Why? There was a pause. Sir? We honestly do not know. The transmission ended before he could ask another question. Ethan slipped the communicator back onto his wrist and continued walking toward the nearest lift instead of rushing. Emergencies had a habit of creating unnecessary panic. Calm usually fixed more problems than speed. As the elevator climbed toward the upper decks, he noticed something unusual. The station felt different. Hallways that normally echoed with conversations and cargo carts had fallen strangely quiet. Crew members stood in small groups, staring through observation windows instead of hurrying toward their assignments. A young technician nearly collided with Ethan before recognizing him. Mr. Brooks? The young man asked. That is me. The technician studied him with open confusion. You are Ethan Brooks? Ethan smiled politely. Last time I checked. The technician opened his mouth as though he wanted to ask another question, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he simply stepped aside. The farther Ethan walked, the more often people looked at him. Not with admiration, not with fear, with curiosity. It reminded him of being the only person carrying an umbrella before everyone else realized it was about to rain. 2 security officers were already waiting outside the main transit junction. Their dark uniforms looked almost ceremonial compared to the grease stains covering Ethan's gray work jacket. One of them offered a respectful nod. Mr. Brooks, Captain Hayes requests your immediate presence. Ethan adjusted the toolbox in his hand. Did one of the reactors finally decide to retire? Neither officer laughed. No, sir. They exchanged a quick glance before the taller one spoke again. There is someone asking for you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Someone? Not exactly. The officer gestured toward the massive observation deck overlooking open space. You should probably see this yourself. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Ethan stepped inside and stopped without realizing it. Beyond the transparent alloy windows stretched an ocean of silent warships, their polished hulls reflecting distant starlight like frozen rivers beneath a winter moon. The formation reached so far into the darkness that the last vessels faded into tiny silver specks. He had seen fleets before during his years working on frontier stations. Nothing remotely close to this. Captain Nora Hayes approached him slowly, studying his face as though expecting recognition. Mr. Brooks, she said carefully, does any of this mean anything to you? Ethan looked from the fleet to the glowing message still hovering above the command table. For simple words stared back at him. Bring us Ethan Brooks. He remained silent for several seconds before quietly shaking his head. I wish I could tell you it does. Yet somewhere beneath years of ordinary routines and forgotten memories, a faint image flickered across his mind. A pair of frightened golden eyes, a cold cargo bay, and the quiet voice of a child thanking him for something he had never considered extraordinary. The memory arrived so quietly that Ethan almost questioned whether it belonged to him at all. The brilliant lights of the command center slowly faded behind the sound of rain striking metal, replaced by the distant hum of cargo engines from a night nearly 18 years earlier. Kestrel Station had looked different then. Newer, cleaner, full of optimistic engineers who believed every broken machine could be fixed with enough patience and one more wrench. Ethan had been 20 years younger, finishing an overnight inspection of the freight docks after a violent electrical storm knocked out half the loading bay. The station lights still flickered every few seconds, leaving long shadows stretched across rows of shipping containers. Cold air drifted through the open cargo doors carrying the smell of ozone, wet steel, and fresh insulation foam. Most workers had already gone home. The silence felt unusual on a station that rarely slept. Ethan balanced a portable work light beneath one arm while checking damaged power conduits along the outer platform. One repair remained before sunrise. Then he planned to grab a cup of terrible station coffee and sleep for 6 uninterrupted hours. A faint metallic sound interrupted his thoughts. Not machinery, not ventilation, something much smaller, like a loose bolt rolling across a steel floor. Ethan stopped walking. The sound came again, this time followed by the soft scrape of movement behind a stack of abandoned cargo containers. He lowered the work light toward the narrow gap. At first he saw nothing except darkness. Then 2 golden eyes reflected the light. They were wide with caution, but strangely calm. Ethan slowly knelt without speaking. A small figure remained perfectly still, hidden beneath a thermal emergency blanket that was several sizes too large. Only a frightened face and slender blue fingers remained visible beneath the worn fabric. She could not have been more than 12 years old by human standards. Dirt covered her cheeks. Fine strands of dark blue hair clung to her forehead. One sleeve had been carefully wrapped around her wrist as though she had tried to make her own bandage. She watched every movement Ethan made without blinking. He noticed something else almost immediately. She was not asking for help. She was waiting to discover whether he would become another reason to run. Ethan carefully placed his toolbox on the floor several feet away before taking one slow step backward instead of forward. He wanted to leave enough space to prove he was not a threat. "You picked a cold place to hide," he said gently. The translator built into the loading bay quietly converted his words into standard galactic. The girl's eyes widened with surprise. She had not expected him to speak her language. Neither of them moved for several long seconds while the rain continued tapping against the station hull overhead. Finally, she spoke so softly that Ethan almost missed it. "I will leave if you want." Her voice carried perfect pronunciation but almost no emotion, as though hope had become something dangerous to express. Ethan glanced around the empty dock. There were no security officers, no customs inspectors, no emergency alerts. Just an exhausted engineer and a frightened child sitting alone behind forgotten cargo. He looked back at her and quietly shook his head. "You do not have to leave because of me." She searched his face, clearly expecting conditions or questions that never came. Instead, Ethan reached into his lunch bag, removed the untouched sandwich he had packed before work, and gently placed it on the floor between them. Then he slid it forward with the tip of his boot before stepping back once more. "You look like you have missed dinner," he said with a tired smile. "I think you need this more than I do." The girl stared at the simple paper wrapper as though it were the most unexpected thing she had ever seen. For several seconds, neither of them reached for the sandwich. The only sound came from rain striking the station hull in an uneven rhythm while distant cargo clamps locked another freighter into its berth somewhere beyond the loading bay. Ethan remained where he was with both hands resting loosely at his sides. Years of working around frightened passengers during emergency evacuations had taught him that trust could never be rushed. It had to be offered first. The young alien studied him with quiet suspicion before carefully pulling the paper package closer. She hesitated again, almost as if accepting kindness carried its own hidden danger. Only after another long moment did she slowly unwrap the sandwich. The smell of fresh bread filled the cool air between them. She looked down at it in silence. "When was the last time you ate?" Ethan asked. She lowered her eyes. "I do not remember." There was no self-pity in her voice. She spoke as though forgetting meals had become an ordinary part of life. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. He had expected fear. He had expected tears. Instead, he found a child who had simply stopped expecting anyone to care. She took one careful bite before stopping again, almost embarrassed to eat in front of him. Ethan smiled faintly and looked away toward the rain beyond the cargo doors, pretending to inspect a damaged loading crane so she would not feel watched. After another minute, the sandwich was gone. When he turned back, some of the tension had disappeared from her shoulders. Color had returned ever so slightly to her blue skin. "Better?" he asked. She gave a small nod. Thank you. The words sounded unfamiliar, as though she had not spoken them very often. Ethan crouched beside his toolbox and opened the upper compartment. Inside were spare thermal wraps, diagnostic equipment, insulated gloves, and a compact emergency medical kit that every maintenance engineer carried. He removed a sealed warming blanket and gently slid it across the floor without stepping closer. "That blanket you have is soaked," he said. "This one will keep you warmer." She looked at the new blanket but did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she asked the first question since they had met. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan blinked. The question caught him completely off guard. He leaned back against a steel container and thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Because you looked cold." She continued watching him. "That cannot be the only reason." Ethan chuckled softly. "Maybe not. My mother used to tell me something when I was your age. She said if you ever find someone alone on the worst day of their life, you should try not to become another reason they lose faith in people." The girl lowered her gaze to the blanket resting between them. A silence settled over the cargo bay again, but this time it felt different. Less fearful, more thoughtful. Finally, she picked up the dry blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was much too large for her small frame, yet for the first time since Ethan had found her, she no longer looked like she was preparing to run. A faint vibration echoed through the deck beneath them as another ship docked somewhere above. The station continued with its ordinary routine, unaware that inside one forgotten cargo bay, a simple conversation was quietly changing two lives. Ethan reached into his toolbox once more and removed a small portable heater used for emergency repairs. He switched it on, and gentle warmth spread through the cold compartment. The young girl held her hands toward the rising heat. For just an instant, the guarded expression in her golden eyes softened into something almost impossible to recognize. It was not happiness yet. It was something much smaller. The fragile beginning of safety. The portable heater filled the small corner of the cargo bay with a quiet stream of warm air, chasing away the chill that had settled into the steel floor during the storm. Ethan leaned against a weathered shipping container, giving the young girl enough space to breathe, while pretending to organize tools that had already been neatly packed away. He had learned long ago that silence could be just as comforting as conversation. Several minutes passed before the girl spoke again. "My name is Lyra." Ethan looked up with a gentle smile. "That is a beautiful name." She tilted her head slightly, as though she had forgotten what a compliment sounded like. "You are not going to ask what family I belong to, should I?" Ethan replied. "Most people do." He shrugged. "If you want to tell me someday, I will listen. If you do not, that is your choice." Lyra studied him carefully, searching for the hidden motive she seemed certain must exist. Finding none only appeared to confuse her more. She wrapped the dry blanket tighter around her shoulders and quietly watched the orange glow from the portable heater dance across the metal floor. For the first time that night, the cargo bay felt less like a hiding place and more like a temporary shelter. Ethan noticed the makeshift bandage around her wrist again. It had been tied with remarkable precision for someone so young, but dark stains had soaked through the fabric. He pointed toward it without moving any closer. "May I take a look at your wrist?" Lyra instinctively pulled her arm closer to her chest. Her golden eyes narrowed with old caution. Ethan nodded in understanding. "Fair enough." He opened the emergency medical kit and placed a fresh roll of sterile wrap, a small bottle of disinfectant, and a packet of skin repair gel on the floor between them before stepping back once again. "You can use these yourself if that makes you more comfortable." Lyra remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then, slowly, she reached forward and picked up the supplies. Ethan turned his attention toward the loading doors, deliberately looking outside while she replaced the worn bandage in private. Beyond the station, rain continued drifting across the docking platforms, illuminated by rows of blue guidance lights that stretched into the darkness like glowing rivers. Freight shuttles arrived and departed with practiced precision, completely unaware that one forgotten corner of the station held a child carrying far more weight than anyone could imagine. "Finished," Lyra said quietly. Ethan turned back. The fresh bandage had been applied carefully. It was not perfect, but it was secure. "Looks much better," he said. A faint expression almost resembling pride crossed her face before disappearing again. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention, all maintenance personnel. Security inspection of Cargo Sector 9 will begin in 15 minutes. Please report any unauthorized individuals immediately. Lyra froze. Every trace of calm vanished from her face. She instinctively reached for the damp emergency blanket as though preparing to disappear into the shadows once more. Ethan saw the fear return before she spoke a single word. He glanced toward the nearest corridor, then back at the frightened child. He knew exactly what station regulations required. Report any unidentified passenger. Wait for security. Let someone else decide what happened next. His eyes rested on the untouched maintenance cart parked beside the wall, its oversized storage compartment designed to carry replacement equipment across the station. An ordinary piece of engineering. Ordinary enough that nobody ever looked inside twice. Ethan slowly closed his toolbox and met Lyra's anxious gaze. "I think," he said with the same calm voice he used when repairing fragile machinery, "we should find you a safer place before the inspectors get here." For the first time since they met, the fear in Lyra's eyes was joined by something new. It was not complete trust. Not yet. But it was the quiet realization that this human had just chosen her well-being over the easier path of simply following the rules. The announcement echoed through Cargo Sector 9 a second time, its calm mechanical voice somehow making the countdown feel even shorter. 15 minutes. Then 14. Ethan rolled the maintenance cart toward the narrow service corridor that connected the freight docks to the station's aging environmental systems. The wheels squeaked softly over the steel floor, nearly disappearing beneath the distant rumble of docking engines. He stopped beside the oversized equipment compartment and lifted the insulated cover. Replacement filters, diagnostic cables, and folded thermal sheets filled the lower half. There was just enough room left for one frightened child. Ethan looked at Lyra with an apologetic smile. "It will not be comfortable, but it will only be for a little while." She hesitated. "Why are you risking this?" He shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "Because I would rather explain myself later than regret doing nothing forever." Lyra quietly climbed inside the compartment. Ethan carefully arranged the thermal sheets around her, leaving enough space for fresh air to circulate through the ventilation slots built into the cart. Before lowering the cover, he placed the portable heater's battery pack beside her. "It will stay warm for another hour," he said. "If you hear voices, stay quiet. I will handle the talking." She looked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the pale maintenance lights. "You trust strangers very easily." Ethan smiled. "Actually, I do not. I just think everyone deserves one chance before they are judged." The cover closed gently. Seconds later, heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. Two security officers appeared around the corner carrying handheld scanners, while a station inspector followed with a digital inspection tablet tucked beneath one arm. Ethan kept pushing the cart at an unhurried pace, humming softly to himself while pretending to study a maintenance checklist clipped to the handle. "Evening," one officer called. Ethan nodded politely. "Good evening." The inspector glanced toward the cart. "Working late again, Brooks?" "Cooling valve failed in Dock 7, Ethan answered. "Replacing filtration units before morning shift." The inspector sighed with familiar frustration. "This station is getting older every month." Ethan chuckled. "So am I." One of the officers swept a portable scanner across the maintenance cart. Ethan watched the display without changing his expression. The old compartment walls were lined with radiation shielding to protect sensitive electronic components during transport. They also happened to interfere with basic life sign scanners. The display flashed only one result: maintenance equipment. The officer handed the scanner back to his partner with little interest. "Looks clear. Carry on," the inspector said before continuing deeper into the cargo sector. Ethan waited until their footsteps completely disappeared before releasing the breath he had not realized he was holding. He guided the cart through another service door that opened into an abandoned environmental control room tucked behind the station's primary air recycling system. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of white light spilling from aging ceiling fixtures. Half the control panels had been disconnected years earlier after newer systems came online. Hardly anyone visited anymore except maintenance crews performing annual inspections. Ethan lifted the compartment cover. Lyra blinked against the brighter light before carefully climbing out. She looked around the forgotten room with quiet curiosity. "Nobody comes here?" she asked. "Almost nobody," Ethan replied. "The machines still work. They just do their jobs so well that everyone forgets they exist." Lyra slowly ran her fingertips across one of the old control consoles. Like some people. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before giving a small nod. Sometimes. A gentle hum filled the room as fresh air flowed steadily through enormous filtration units hidden behind reinforced walls. The sound was calm, almost comforting, like slow breathing. Ethan reached into a nearby storage locker and pulled out a clean blanket, a bottle of drinking water, and a package of emergency meal bars left over from disaster preparedness supplies. He placed everything on a metal workbench without making a ceremony of it. Lyra stared at the simple collection of ordinary things. No questions, no conditions, no demands. Just kindness offered again, as naturally as if helping a frightened child were simply another repair that needed to be made. The forgotten control room slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm that seemed untouched by the rest of the station. Massive air processors hummed behind reinforced walls, pushing warm currents through endless networks of ventilation ducts. Tiny indicator lights blinked across dusty control panels in steady patterns that had not changed in years. Ethan always liked this room because it reminded him that the most important things often worked quietly, asking for neither praise nor attention. Lyra sat on the edge of the metal workbench with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and the unopened meal bar resting in both hands. She looked less frightened now, but she remained constantly aware of every sound beyond the heavy maintenance door. Years of uncertainty had trained her to expect interruptions whenever life briefly felt safe. Ethan noticed she had still not touched the emergency food. "It is yours," he said gently. "You do not have to save it." Lyra lowered her eyes. "Where I come from, we learn not to eat everything at once." Ethan nodded slowly. "Just in case tomorrow is worse than today?" She looked up, surprised that he understood without needing an explanation. After a quiet moment, she broke the meal bar in half instead of eating the entire thing. She carefully wrapped one piece inside the empty paper wrapper and slipped it into the pocket of the dry blanket. Ethan smiled to himself. Some habits were stronger than hunger. He reached for an old electric kettle sitting forgotten on a maintenance shelf and filled it with filtered water from the emergency supply line. A few minutes later, gentle steam drifted into the room, carrying the comforting smell of herbal tea. He handed one warm cup to Lyra before taking another for himself. She accepted it cautiously, turning the cup between her hands before taking a small sip. The warmth seemed to surprise her almost as much as the taste. "This is good," she whispered. Ethan laughed softly. "It is cheap station tea. You are probably the first person who has ever complimented it." A tiny smile appeared across Lyra's face. It lasted only a second, but it completely changed the room. She suddenly looked much younger than the frightened child he had found behind the cargo containers. For a brief moment, she looked exactly like someone who should have been laughing with friends instead of hiding from strangers. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the ceiling where warm air disappeared into the ventilation system. "You know," he said, "when I first started working here, I thought fixing machines would be the hardest part of the job." Lyra listened quietly. "Turns out machines are honest. When something breaks, they usually tell you. People are much harder to understand." She tilted her head. "Yet you still help them." Ethan shrugged. "Most people are carrying problems you cannot see. Sometimes they just need someone who notices." Lyra remained silent for several moments before asking the question that had clearly been growing inside her all evening. "What if helping someone causes trouble for you?" Ethan looked at the worn maintenance gloves resting beside his toolbox. The leather had faded after years of repairs, but he refused to replace them because they still worked. "Then you deal with the trouble," he answered simply. "Doing the right thing has never promised to be convenient." The room fell quiet again except for the steady breathing of the air processors. Outside, the station continued its ordinary routine. Cargo ships departed. Crews changed shifts. Announcements echoed through distant corridors. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. Inside the forgotten maintenance room, however, something far more important had begun to change. Lyra looked at the human engineer with new eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she realized kindness was not always a transaction. Sometimes it arrived carrying nothing more than a warm cup of tea, a safe place to rest, and a stranger who never once asked whether helping her would be worth the cost. The station clocks quietly marked another hour while the forgotten maintenance room remained hidden behind layers of humming machinery and aging ventilation ducts. Ethan had spread an old maintenance blanket across the floor after insisting that the workbench was no place for anyone to sleep. Lyra sat with her knees drawn close, watching the slow rotation of the ceiling fan that had probably been installed decades before either of them had been born. It clicked softly every few seconds, an imperfect rhythm that somehow made the room feel more alive. Ethan busied himself inspecting a faulty pressure regulator mounted on the wall, tightening loose fittings that did not actually need attention. He understood that some people found it easier to speak when they were not being watched. Eventually, Lyra broke the silence. "You have not asked where I came from." Ethan kept working, tightening one final bolt before answering. "I figured you would tell me if you wanted me to know." She looked down at the warm cup resting in her hands. "Most people ask first and listen second." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds exhausting." A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound surprised both of them. It lasted only a moment, but it echoed warmly through the old control room. Ethan glanced over his shoulder with an amused expression. "There it is." Lyra blinked. "What?" "The laugh. I had a feeling it was still in there somewhere." She lowered her head, unable to hide the small smile that lingered afterward. The walls she had built so carefully over countless uncertain days were beginning to crack, not because anyone forced them apart, but because someone had simply waited with patience. Outside the maintenance room, distant footsteps echoed briefly through the corridor before fading away again. Ethan quietly walked to the heavy door and listened for several seconds before returning. "Still clear," he said. Lyra nodded with visible relief. "Will they keep searching?" "Probably until morning," Ethan admitted. "People tend to keep looking for things they do not understand." She turned the empty cup slowly between her fingers. "My mother used to say that fear makes intelligent people forget to be curious." Ethan leaned against the workbench. "Your mother sounds wise." Lyra's expression softened. She was. The single word carried enough weight that Ethan chose not to ask another question. Instead, he opened one of the dusty storage cabinets and found a faded deck of playing cards left behind by another maintenance crew years earlier. The corners were bent and several cards had coffee stains across them, but the deck was still complete. He placed it on the workbench. "Do you know how to play cards?" Lyra studied the unfamiliar objects with genuine curiosity. "No." Ethan shuffled them slowly. "Good. That means I finally get to win." She tilted her head. "You assume you would." Ethan laughed. "Fair point." He spent the next half hour teaching her a simple game that required nothing more than matching numbers and paying attention. At first, Lyra hesitated before every move, carefully studying each card as though expecting hidden rules. Then, little by little, caution gave way to confidence. She even corrected one of Ethan's intentional mistakes with quiet satisfaction. "You skipped your turn," she said. Ethan looked down dramatically. "Did I?" She nodded. "You did." "Well," he replied, pretending to sigh. "I guess I cannot fool you anymore." Another smile appeared, this one lasting longer than the first. For a little while, the enormous galaxy beyond the station ceased to matter. There were no governments, no borders, no mysterious pasts waiting to be uncovered. There was only an aging engineer, a frightened young traveler, a worn deck of cards, and the rare comfort of sharing an ordinary evening. Long after the game had ended and the maintenance room had fallen quiet once more, Lyra carefully gathered the cards into a neat stack before looking at Ethan with thoughtful eyes. "If I ever have a home again," she said softly, "I hope it feels like this." Ethan looked around the dusty room filled with old machines and flickering lights before smiling to himself. "Then I hope your home is full of people who remember that kindness does not have to be expensive to change someone's life." Morning arrived without sunlight, as it always did aboard Kestrel Station. Instead, soft white illumination gradually brightened the maintenance room, while the steady hum of the air processors never once missed a beat. Ethan was already awake, tightening the strap on his old toolbox before checking the corridor through the small observation window built into the heavy service door. Everything appeared quiet. Too quiet. He turned back to find Lyra carefully folding the blanket he had given her. She smoothed every corner with deliberate care before placing it neatly on the workbench exactly as she had found it. Ethan smiled. "You do not have to do that." She looked at him with gentle seriousness. "Where I come from, we leave borrowed things better than we receive them." Ethan nodded approvingly. "Your mother taught you well." A faint sadness crossed her face, But this time it did not remain there long. Before either of them could speak again, Ethan's wrist communicator vibrated. A secure maintenance frequency. "Brooks," he answered quietly. An older voice came through the speaker. "Environmental Division. We have a private shuttle requesting temporary access to Service Dock 3. No cargo manifest. No commercial registration. Clearance codes are unusual." Ethan frowned. "Military. Older than military. Diplomatic priority from systems I have never seen before." The transmission ended. Ethan looked toward Lyra. Her expression had changed. She had gone perfectly still, listening not with fear this time, but with recognition. "You know who they are," Ethan said softly. She slowly nodded. "They found me." Neither of them hurried. There was no panic in the room. Only the quiet understanding that every journey eventually reached a crossroads. Ethan walked with Lyra through the empty maintenance corridors toward the isolated service dock. The air carried the familiar scent of machine oil and recycled oxygen, while the polished floor reflected rows of white guidance lights beneath their feet. When the docking doors finally opened, a single silver shuttle rested silently on the platform. It was elegant without being extravagant, its smooth hull reflecting the station lights like calm water beneath a winter sky. 3 figures stepped down the boarding ramp wearing simple blue ceremonial uniforms. They carried no visible weapons. The oldest among them paused several feet away before placing one hand across his chest and bowing deeply toward Lyra. "We have searched for you across 12 sectors," he said. "Welcome home." Ethan quietly stepped back, believing his part in the story had ended. Instead, Lyra turned toward him first. She walked across the docking platform until she stood directly in front of him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached into the pocket of the oversized blanket she still carried and removed half of the emergency meal bar she had saved the night before. The wrapper was carefully folded exactly as he remembered. She held it out with both hands. "You told me everyone deserves one chance before they are judged," she whispered. I wanted to remember the first person who proved those words were real. Ethan looked at the small piece of preserved food and felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. It was worth almost nothing. Yet somehow it felt more valuable than any medal he could have imagined receiving. He accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Take care of yourself, Lyra." She smiled, no longer with uncertainty, but with quiet confidence. "Because of you, I think I finally know how." She turned and walked toward the waiting shuttle. At the top of the boarding ramp, she stopped one final time and looked back. Neither of them waved. Neither of them needed to. Some promises did not require words. The shuttle lifted gently from the docking platform before disappearing into the endless sea of stars beyond the station. Ethan stood alone for another minute, then adjusted the strap on his worn toolbox and headed back toward the maintenance corridors. A cooling valve still needed replacing before the afternoon shift. Air filters still required inspection. Life, as always, continued moving forward. Yet somewhere beyond the stars, a frightened child had found her way home carrying a lesson no machine could ever manufacture. Years would pass before the galaxy understood what had begun inside one forgotten maintenance room. Empires would remember the admiral she became, but she would always remember the engineer who offered a sandwich before asking a single question, because sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the quiet foundation upon which entire civilizations choose to stand.